The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So after multiple denials, the New York Times and CNN are both reporting now that Saudi Arabia is going to admit that, yes, journalist for the Washington Post, American resident Jamal Khashoggi, did die at their embassy in Istanbul, Turkey. And the implications are very far-reaching, to say the least. We talked yesterday about the story, and we talked yesterday only about what we knew at that time, which was that although everything pointed to Saudi Arabia having a hand in and likely being responsible for the death of the journalist, they had vehemently denied it multiple times, including reportedly to Donald Trump. And we spoke about the geopolitical implications, we talked about the economic implications, and a lot more. And at this point, on the facts, nobody should be surprised that Khashoggi died in Saudi custody or at the hands of the Saudis. That's been pretty obvious for days. And the way specifically that Saudi Arabia, according to the reporting we have right now from the New York Times and CNN, and this may change by the time you listen to this or you watch this, Saudi Arabia is going to frame this as it was an accidental death due to a botched interrogation at the embassy in Istanbul. Now there is also visual evidence of him entering that embassy in Istanbul, which we have on the screen behind me for our television and video audience. And as a reminder, before we get to sort of the full explanation that we're anticipating from the Saudis, yesterday I played video for you of Donald Trump proposing, really in a way that provided cover for the Saudis, that it could have been random rogue killers, amorphous, nameless, unknown rogue killers who took the journalist out. Here's just a reminder of what Trump said yesterday.
With that being said, the king firmly denied any knowledge of it. He didn't really know. Maybe, I don't want to get into his mind, but it sounded to me like maybe these could have been rogue killers. Who knows? We're going to try getting to the bottom of it very soon, but his was a flat denial.
Do you believe his denial? Do you believe his denial? What?
Yeah. So did Donald Trump say this sincerely when he said it yesterday? If so, it would suggest that Saudi Arabia was directly lying to Trump personally, and we would hope that that would have repercussions. But we'll get to that. Saudi Arabia initially, again, saying they know nothing about it, had nothing to do with it, despite information from very early on that one of the few places that Khashoggi went when he was in Istanbul was to the Saudi embassy there, and specific information suggesting he was not only murdered, but also dismembered. Their new explanation is reportedly, again, as I mentioned and alluded to, this was an interrogation that they were doing of Jamal Khashoggi, but the interrogation went wrong and he ended up dead. And as the details come out, the story gets even more bizarre. Turkish officials are claiming, and believe me, I know that when the Turkish officials claim something, we have to be cautious and skeptical. Turkish officials say that a Saudi autopsy specialist entered the country carrying a bone saw in a group of 15 Saudis who came into Turkey the day that Khashoggi disappeared. This has all the markings of and appears to be yet another disgustingly brutal and atrocious act by the Saudis. And what is, you know, we often say 50 people shot in Chicago over the weekend, but it's this one person that got shot in South Carolina that makes the news. Or 10,000 kids died of hunger in Africa yesterday, but the two that died on the London subway make the news. Consider how many people in Yemen have died at the hands of Saudi Arabia over the last year. That doesn't mean that the Khashoggi story is a non-story, but it is part, it's always a media story as well. What makes the news?
The interrogation gone wrong explanation, that could be right.
It could be.
It's very interesting, though. Like, was he threatened with a bone saw and wouldn't cooperate with them, so he ended up getting dismembered. We have to know the details about this.
Was the bone saw brought in after he had already died in order to literally take him apart? I mean, it's gruesome what we're talking about here. And it's also important to understand that if Trump didn't come up with the rogue killers theory himself, and he was really told that by the Saudi royal family, this means they're straight up lying to the president, which would hopefully carry some diplomatic repercussions. But in the era of Trump, it's not clear that it will. Rogue killers is sort of accurate in that it's the Saudis behave like rogue killers, right? In that sense, it is sort of accurate. But beyond that, I think we know that that was not an accurate assessment. And the real problem is that we seem to have this dictator-believing, dictator-friendly White House right now. And it is a story about Saudi Arabia, but as an American show, this is also a story about our relationship with this brutal regime. The story from Saudi Arabia was never believable, right? Embassies are very secure. There are cameras everywhere. There are visitor logs and security checks. The idea that Jamal Khashoggi had been at the embassy and 2 weeks later the Saudi royal family still just didn't know, they weren't sure, or they hadn't heard that he had been at the embassy, was laughable from the beginning. The only question is, have they been straight up lying the entire time? And do we believe that it was an interrogation gone wrong? And I think you're right, Pat, that it could have been. But it's also just as likely, if not more likely, that it was an interrogation followed by a deliberate execution. And they're calling it an interrogation gone wrong because we'll never really know.
And even if the Saudis did lie to Trump, it's clear that he's not going to do anything about it.
You don't think so?
He said during the 60 Minutes interview that he wasn't considering sanctions and that there are other ways, supposedly, to punish Saudi Arabia over this. But he also made it clear that he wants to keep that $110 billion arms deal. And for him, the life of this one journalist just isn't worth that much.
Well, this is important because it is one journalist. It is one life that appears to have been brutally ended early. It's an American resident. It's a journalist working for the Washington Post. The idea that we would accept as a reasonable explanation that, it was an interrogation and the Saudis miscalculated and he ended up dead. Whether it's true or not is irrelevant because it's not an actual explanation that would say to us, oh, well, no repercussions are warranted. The repercussions here are ones that we've been calling for a very long time. If it's this that causes that to happen, great. It may just expose the degree to which Trump is just enamored and complicit with brutal authoritarians all over the world. I genuinely don't know what the follow-up will be, but you can be sure that we are going to be covering it. It appears that Robert Mueller is at least initially going to question Donald Trump in the Russia investigation in writing, meaning that Trump's lawyers will be allowed to write totally innocuous, probably non-perjury answers to questions from Robert Mueller. If this is all that is going to take place as far as the questioning of Trump, it's a total disaster. So this is according to sources that are directly involved with the process. They told CBS News that this is going on. Importantly, we don't know whether this is it for Trump's involvement or if this is just step one. When CNN first reported it, one of Trump's lawyers, Jay Sekulow, said no comment. And CNN said, we don't know whether this is the first of multiple rounds of questions or if there's the possibility of asking follow-up questions, or if it will culminate in an in-person interview. We just didn't know. And it's been a huge topic of contention for months now. We know that this rotating cast of lawyers that Donald Trump has been trying to avoid Trump sitting down in person with Robert Mueller, period. And we knew that they wanted written questions and answers. And at least based on the current reporting, there will be a round of questions and answers in writing, but we don't know if this is a precursor to the real interview or not. Rudy Giuliani says we are not prepared to agree to more questions until this first group of questions is asked, answered, and someone can explain why that isn't enough. Reasons why only written questions are not sufficient includes that, sort of like with the FBI investigation of Brett Kavanaugh was not sufficient because it didn't even include questions to Kavanaugh. There's no opportunity to explore whether Trump is telling the whole truth if you just do written questions, right? That phrase, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. It's easier to enforce that when you can follow up with the person and they're sitting right in front of you, because Trump's lawyers will likely stick to the truth in their answers. but they're not going to volunteer the whole truth. And this is one of those cases where the whole truth is really where Trump could get messed up and end up exposing the obstruction, the lies, the possible criminality. And the most pressing question is, why would Mueller allow this? And there's a few possibilities. Number one, if Robert Mueller starts to think he's not going to be able to get an in-person interview, that if he has to subpoena Trump, that the subpoena would be ignored or challenged, then maybe you say, as Robert Mueller, if this is all I can get, I will do some written questions. That's one possibility. The more sort of clever or devious explanation would be maybe Mueller is so well prepared that he's hoping to get some lies or contradictions in writing from Trump's lawyers because they may not know what Mueller already has. And getting lies in writing would be much more powerful if they are Trump's sworn statements than the sort of subjective, offhanded comments that you might get during an in-person interview. But I'm thinking like super optimistically here.
Yeah, I'm leaning towards that second explanation because
really?
The Mueller investigation has been going on for well over a year at this point. So you have to imagine they have quite a bit of evidence and they know what went down. And, you know, maybe this is the best they can get out of Trump because he is a sitting president and he is so busy after all.
Yes, of course.
But
tweeting about Horseface Stormy. Yeah.
They could definitely catch him in a lie or a few lies here.
The truth is that if Trump did collude with the Russians or obstruct justice or whatever else, he's probably lying to his lawyers anyway. So you may end up in a situation where what Trump's lawyers present to Mueller are lies, but they are Trump's lies. In other words, his own lawyers may not even know that those are lies. And Bob Woodward actually describes a conversation between Trump's lawyer, Jay Sekulow, and the Mueller team, where Jay Sekulow and maybe even John Dowd also say, we can't let Trump look like an idiot because the transcripts will be released. Other countries will realize that Trump is a, quote, goddamn dumbbell. That's a quote, and that type of thing. But I actually don't know that that's really a concern in the sense that it's a concern that other leaders think Trump is a dumbbell. But they probably already know that if they've dealt with him. I don't know that transcripts of an interview with Mueller would really expose that. But to go back to Mueller for a second, the most interesting theory I've seen about why Mueller would agree to written answers for now is that he may not think that he can legally subpoena Trump successfully now and get him in the room, but if he gets written answers that directly contradict what other witnesses have said, maybe that would give him stronger legal justification for pushing for the enforcement of a subpoena. It's a hypothesis.
I would just hope that these questions are falsifiable, right? I hope he's asking, did you know about the Trump Tower meeting ahead of time? Did you know that Russia was trying to help and influence your campaign? Because, yeah, sure, lawyers can kind of work their way around that, but in the end, those are yes or no questions.
And Mueller may already have evidence to confirm that those are things Trump knew or talked about or met with people at the time. What I think is most likely to happen here is what happened with Kavanaugh. I hate to be pessimistic, but it will be, listen, he answered the questions. There was nothing obvious in the questions that justified mandating or forcing an in-person meeting, and we're going to have to continue the investigation just on the basis of these written answers. That's what I believe is the most likely outcome here, but I do want to hear from you about it. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Kenneth Johnson. Kenneth, thank you. We do depend on the support of viewers, listeners who sign up for membership or pledge on Patreon. Today's sustaining longtime member of the day is Lynn Fletcher, dating all the way back to August of 2013. Lynn's been with us more than 5 years. Kenneth, Lynn, thank you. Join them at www.joinpakman.com. Pennies a day to support independent media, or at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. This next story would be sort of dumb sidebar were it not for the fact that it goes to the total debasement of American politics and basic honesty in our country. And it's the story of Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, who's been attacked for a long time for claiming Native American heritage in her family. She's been ridiculed for this. Donald Trump has made it a habit of making fun of her by calling her Pocahontas many times. I could play 15 minutes of examples for you. Here's just one, right? Just to give you a sense of how he does it.
You'll have plenty of those Democrats coming over, and you're going to say, no, sir, no, thank you. No, ma'am, perhaps, ma'am. It may be Pocahontas. Remember that.
Donald Trump also previously said that if Elizabeth Warren took a DNA test and released it, and it showed that she had Native American ancestry, or as Trump likes to call it, that she was an Indian, that he would donate $1 million to the charity of her choice. And Elizabeth Warren has done that. She's published her DNA results. It seems to be more about 2020 to try to be able to say, listen, I've dealt with that issue if she does indeed want to run for president in 2020, than about her campaign right now here in Massachusetts, which she's going to handily win. And Stanford professor Carlos Bustamante, who's an expert in data science and genomics, said that, is it genomics or genomics?
I think it's genomics.
I think it's genomics. I say genomics. Said that the vast majority of Elizabeth Warren's ancestry is European, but that, quote, the results strongly support the existence of an unadmixed Native American ancestor in the individual's pedigree somewhere between 6 and 10 generations ago, which critics will point out 10 generations would mean that she is 1,024th Native American. So the immediate questions were, number one, why is Warren doing this now? Answer, again, I think it's about getting it out of the way if she wants to advance a presidential run in 2020. Interestingly, Donald Trump is not ready to donate the $1 million. Trump was asked about this yesterday morning, and he straight up denied ever having made the promise to donate $1 million. Check this out.
Why did you argue off the table?
Releasing the results of the DNA test.
No, I have no. Who cares? Who cares?
$1 million to charity.
I didn't say that. I didn't. You better read it again.
Now, here is Donald Trump himself making the promise. And tell me, Pat, if my ears are deceiving me. This is from July 5th, where Donald Trump said exactly what he denied saying there.
And we will say, I will give you $1 million to your favorite charity, paid for by Trump, if you take the test and it shows you're an Indian. You know.
Shows you're an Indian. I like how the crowd cheers that. Like, what are you cheering there, right?
Well, maybe that's providing him cover, right? Because it turns out she's Native American partially, and
yes, not Indian. She's not claiming any Indian ancestry dating back to the Indian subcontinent. He can argue he was kidding. He can argue it doesn't really show that she is Native American if she's only 1,024th Native American. But how can he argue that he never said it? And while we're at it, didn't Sean Hannity say he'd get waterboarded if something or other happened and he didn't do it? I think that that's also a promise that I just remembered.
I would like to see that. Maybe he could make it longer than Mancow Mueller did. What was that, like 4 seconds?
4 seconds
under waterboarding
like
torture?
That, yeah. So the latest is Trump says he will only donate the $1 million if he can test Elizabeth Warren himself. I don't even know what that means. Like he's not a DNA.
I don't want to know what that means.
I don't want to know what Trump imagines it would mean for him to personally test Elizabeth Warren's DNA. In any case, does anybody find it odd that if you have a drop of African blood, according to some of these rightists, you're black? But if you have a Native American great-great-great-grandmother, you're not Native American and it's okay to mock you as Pocahontas. And I want to be like crystal clear here, okay? If you are arguing that Elizabeth Warren has not experienced setbacks in her life on the basis of being Native American, I'm with you, okay? I have seen no evidence whatsoever that whether or not Elizabeth Warren is 1,024th or 1,512th or whatever it is Native American, I have seen no evidence whatsoever that she has suffered setbacks in her experience in life as a wealthy 60-something-year-old woman. If I'm wrong, show me the evidence. There is no question whatsoever here that her Native American heritage is minor. It's more than mine. I mean, I have none. Like, I have no Native American heritage, period, in my background. So she has more than me. But does it relate to her experience as a person in the United States of America? No, I don't think so. But if I had an Italian great-great-great-grandmother, would it be okay to start calling me Guido sarcastically or whatever, right? Like, if I had an Irish ancestor, is it acceptable for the president to jokingly mock me as Mick or something? That's the point here, which is, again, the debasement of the politics. And if you want to come to me and say, no, David, the real problem here is that Elizabeth Warren actually received an advantage on the basis of claiming this Native American heritage, come to me and prove that, because I've not seen that. People who say, well, she was classified at Harvard as Native American. That's different than being an affirmative action admission on that basis. And I've not seen evidence of that.
To the contrary, there was a comprehensive Boston Globe study that looked into this.
Yeah.
And it proves just that she wasn't admitted on the basis of her being Native American, and that wasn't even considered. It was more just about how she was listed in the faculty directory.
Yes.
So she wasn't doing this to get ahead or anything like that.
And again, I don't believe that there would be any reason to afford her that getting ahead, because I don't believe that she was hindered in any way by this supposed Native American heritage, which we now are told by a genomicist, is that a word? That it is a likely part of her ancestry. Send me your thoughts about where you are on this. Now, here's where I really want to get into. This is the main story for me from the Elizabeth Warren DNA situation. The question for me is not what is her exact Native American ancestry. It's partially about Trump lying, claiming initially that he would donate $1 million if she has a DNA test that shows she's Native American. Then he said he never said it. Now he says he wants to test her DNA himself. For me, the most interesting sort of after effect of the DNA story is that the Russian troll bots have been activated hugely. There is a really well put together Reddit post that points out that the hashtag Pocahontas, Trump's nickname for Elizabeth Warren, as well as a whole bunch of other terms, as you can see on screen, like Native American, DNA, and other terms, were trending on Hamilton 68, which is a website that tracks Kremlin propaganda, as well as on a website called Bot Sentinel, which also tracks troll bots and fake news accounts. Russian trolls are specifically posting and reposting and linking to a fake news article from True Pundit, which straight up claims that Elizabeth Warren faked her Native American ancestry. If you look at the top posts on a notoriously Russian troll-riddled subreddit called _Donald, as of this morning, 8 of the 11 top posts from the prior 24 hours were related to Elizabeth Warren. And if you classify or sort of categorize the comments and the positions that are being espoused, the ones that are getting the most play on the internet are, number one, the average American has more Native American DNA than Elizabeth Warren. Number two, Harvard had her listed as a person of color. And number three, anything less than 1% doesn't mean anything. So the question is, why? Why would Russian trolls and bots focus on the Elizabeth Warren DNA story, which is a seemingly sort of transient and niche story that's not going to have any major coverage even a week from now or a few days from now? And the answer appears to be that the answer appears to you, I would say, when you ask yourself, what is the objective of the Kremlin in all of this, right? Why is the Kremlin meddling in our election, using Trump to their advantage? The whole point is to destabilize the U.S. and to create or grow cracks in the social fabric, to distract, to create strife, particularly among racial lines. The Elizabeth Warren DNA test results themselves aren't the important thing for the Kremlin narrative. But filling the internet with posts and fake news articles about apparent obsession with the story distracts from stories like Russian collusion, Trump's taxes, Trump blowing up the trade deficit despite claiming his terrorists would fix it. And the really important part is that it draws out the racists. Remember that 2 stories that activated the Russian troll bots were the Baltimore police unrest and the Ferguson, Missouri protest. Both were highly racialized stories, and this is straight out of the Russian geopolitical playbook. The book, Foundations of Geopolitics by Alexander Dugin, specifically advises that in the United States, what Russia should do is use its special services to fuel instability and separatism, and specifically to promote, quote, Afro-American racists. Russia should, according to the playbook from 1997, introduce geopolitical disorder into internal American activity, encourage ethnic separatism and racial conflict. That's why the Russians love the DNA story. Mentioning DNA at all brings out the racists. It's got an overlap as well with the race and IQ crowd. And in general, any story that helps split people among racial or ethnic lines or gets people thinking that way is good for Russia, and it fuels the exact kind of instability that Russia wants. And additionally, the Russians may already be anticipating that Warren could be a strong presidential candidate in 2020. So why not have the double benefit of starting to litter the internet with this type of stuff about her? That is the most interesting element for me about the Elizabeth Warren DNA story, which is that it has become a favorite story instantly of the Russian trolls and the Russian bots. Send me your thoughts. Make sure that you are following the show on Instagram at David Pakman Show. Follow me on Instagram at david.pakman. Quick break, back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
The documentary film The Devil We Know is out on iTunes. Joining me to talk about it is America's lawyer Mike Papantonio, who's featured in the film for his work on the case against Dupont and a toxic chemical called C8, which was dumped into the Ohio River Valley. You can also find out more about the film at thedevilweknow.com. So, Pap, since we last spoke about this case, a lot has happened here. And at this point, there is absolutely no doubt about what DuPont knew and when they knew it. I guess maybe to start, for people who don't know, when they hear Teflon, they think we're talking about the end product itself, those nonstick pans. But we're actually talking about a chemical that's used in the production of Teflon. So maybe we start there and sort of how you became aware of this and got involved.
Well, I was hired by an attorney that had worked on this case. He was actually a corporate defense attorney. It's a pretty interesting kind of combination, but he was brought in. He had a family member that was having serious physical problems. And he was actually, and this was 15 years ago, he was brought in to take a look at it. As he started looking at it, he found that people who are raising cattle along the Ohio River or the tributaries along the Ohio River, that the cattle were dying of very specific kinds of illnesses. Birth defects all started looking exactly alike, the way that they would manifest themselves, the cancers that started showing up in people all along the river. And so what he did is he asked me if I would try the case. And so we had a couple of test cases that we started off with in Ohio, in Columbus, Ohio, which is typically how this is handled. You'll have, in this case, you had 3,000 people that were affected. You actually had 70,000 people that their water was contaminated, but 3,000 people actually were signed up and showed that they had very specific kind of medical issues ranging from gastrointestinal to cancer, to testicular cancer and liver cancer, kidney cancer, which were all consistent with the C8 exposure. Their own documents, DuPont's own documents, showed that they knew as early as the 1970s that this product had the ability to cause cancer, and they dumped it in people's drinking water all along the Ohio River.
Why do you think that this story, which when you consider the amount of people that are in population areas that are touched by the Ohio River, I mean, the number of people affected by this is staggering if you include all of the ways people are affected by this. Why don't you think this story got the attention that, for example, the Flint water crisis did when we compare, you know, strictly speaking, a lot of people were affected by this runoff?
Well, the media didn't have, they didn't have to worry about advertisers with the Flint story. There were no corporations that you could point your finger to. There were only politicians that the media could go after. Here, the story was in front of the media, the national media, for about 30 years. And they chose to do nothing because DuPont was such a huge advertiser for them. I mean, they were a massive advertiser for the media. So the trade-off was, we won't talk about this. You keep spending $2 million a year with us on this ad campaign, and we'll let things go. That's exactly what the media did. The media was owned and operated by DuPont for 3 decades. And so that's why this story did not really surface until actually we went to trial, and the jury came back 4 times and hammered DuPont 4 times. And not only said that you did wrong, but they punished them for the conduct was so callous. It was such ugly conduct. And so then all of a sudden the media had to actually be journalists rather than advertising agents for DuPont. And so that's when the story actually started surfacing. The story's been out there a long time. People were drinking this water. People in most cities around the country have it in their drinking water. It's so, as this film shows, the film is, I got to tell you, I've been involved in several documentaries, David. The filmmakers in this, first of all, are huge award-winning filmmakers, but they did so well at the Sundance Film Festival that the folks at Sundance determined that there were 3 films that they needed to help get the word out on those 3 films. This was one of them because of the social and cultural ramifications, the health ramifications of this catastrophe that was caused by 3M and DuPont primarily.
Yeah, I mean, the film is great, not only in terms of how it's produced, and it shows both the kind of personal impact on the victims, it shows the legal process that was going on, and shows how those 2 things relate. But it's also so important in my mind because what you just described about corporate media's reluctance to cover the story, we have a justice system that, as you know, because of the space you work in, it overwhelmingly focuses on street crime and not nearly enough on corporate crime and also white-collar crime. Corporate media mirrors that. Corporate media also focusing on the salacious and sort of neat and compact street crime stories versus these corporate malfeasance stories. So if not from the documentaries and independent media, I don't know how we would even learn about these things. You
wouldn't. No, you would not have. That's the interesting thing about it. Here is something that is so ubiquitous. It's just out there in such a broad expanse, as this film talks about. They're even finding it in polar bears in the Arctic. So that shows you that it's virtually in everybody's blood at this point. God didn't put it there. DuPont or 3M put it there. And now, so what the industry did, and the film is very good on showing how the industry captured the EPA. And they not only captured media, they captured the EPA. And they actually were hiring people out of the EPA. They would go to them and say, Joe, we know you're doing this study, but by the way, how would you like to come to work for us for $300,000 a year? You're making 100 now. What do you think? And so all of a sudden, this revolving door started with the EPA, with the DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection, all up and down the Ohio River Valley. But you mentioned the DOJ. This is the really ugly part of it. Both the Eric Holder administration had all of this information, every bit of it. They had possession of it. They had reviewed it. They chose not to prosecute, even though I've been a prosecutor, and I can tell you, they had so much material that it was virtually impossible for them not to get a conviction of several of the people that were involved in this. But they chose not to because, as you point out, these people, they look different. They're dressed up in suits. They have MBAs. They don't look like the kid on the street corner in a hoodie that goes to prison for life if he's caught 3 times selling drugs. These people were not even investigated by Eric Holder or by Ashcroft. I could go right down the path.
Well, I wanted to ask you about
Democrats,
that, Pat.
There was no difference between the way the Democrats handled it and the way the Republicans handled it. It was all about DuPont handing out big amounts of money to all of these politicians.
Yeah, when we would talk to you, including about this case and others, during the Obama era, you were very hard on the Obama EPA and on the Obama Justice Department, and correctly so. What's going on with the current EPA and the Justice Department?
Oh, it's worse. I mean, I say it's worse. I don't know that you could have gotten, the last EPA was basically dysfunctional. Granted, the people that they had appointed didn't look as bad, but they were corporatist. Now we have, for example, the the head of the chief litigator for BP with this new EPA, chief litigator for BP is in charge of the Department of Justice, the environmental prosecution for environmental cases in the country. He's the guy in charge of that. He was just appointed by Trump, approved by both Democrats and Republicans. The guy is a thug. I mean, as you know, we handled the BP case. We handled them all along the coast here. He's an absolute thug. And so, but now he's in charge of the EPA. So yeah, he made the news. We heard about him, but to tell you there was any real big difference in the appointments of Obama, it would be it's a tough stretch, really, to say, yeah, they sounded better on paper, but when it came to really enforcement, they were really nothing but Wall Street corporatists. They were Democrats, yeah. This guy's Republican, yeah, but he's a corporatist. He's a corporatist environmental agency leader right now. So there's no difference. We want to think, this is different. This film is really good at talking about these issues we're talking about right now. I mean, these people did a wonderful job on this film.
Yeah, there's a scene in the film, actually, and this is what I wanted to talk to you about next, which sort of puts out there the idea that if an individual were to show up at a river or, at a downtown somewhere where people are hanging out and start sprinkling arsenic around, that would be a crime. Like, they would get arrested for that. That would be a very specific crime. But that's effectively what corporations, and in this case, what was happening with C8, is this bigger than a Justice Department? Like, is this more about the protection that corporate entities provide that lead to basically fines being paid and no real people going to prison?
Well, there's a, there is within the area of the law, there's this really, he's kind of a nut. I mean, he really is a nut. His name is Posner. He's a federal judge up in the Chicago area. And he has engineered and pioneered the way that we ought to review cases. And he came up with the economics of law. Yeah, a corporation may do something completely deplorable. They might kill people. They might poison people and give them cancer. But this idiot, I very easily call him an idiot. He's an egg-headed idiot named Posner. He's a federal appellate court up around Chicago. He said, well, yeah, we're going to kill people, but we have to look at the economics of killing those people. Are people employed at that corporation? So maybe it's okay to kill people. There's the economy projected because of that conduct. Well, maybe it's okay to kill people. That's the new norm within the federal judiciary, and certainly is the new norm within the Department of Justice. I just can't tell you how bad, I just almost can't put words to how bad Eric Holder was. And we thought he was a hero, didn't we? Oh, he's appointed by Obama. He must certainly is going to look out for consumers, where he didn't. He did not. We see the same thing with opioids. I'm seeing exactly the same Eric Holder footprints on the opioid litigation as I saw in this litigation with Dupont. So go figure. That's just the reality. It's tribal politics is the only reason we say that we're going to preserve him as a hero. He's not a hero.
Last thing I want to talk about, when we last spoke about this, there were sort of two, I believe, major plaintiffs at the time, and there have since been some verdicts. What's the sort of totality of the cases and verdicts so far on C8?
Well, I mean, the verdicts have ranged anywhere from $2 million to $8 million. I mean, if they had DuPont not come out with a first phase of settlement, we would have continued being in trial. Now, the way the settlement is built, for the next 5 years, people coming forward with these injuries have the right to either try them or settle their cases. So it was built with that in mind, because there's some latency to this. You're not exposed to C8 day 1 and have cancer day 2. So there's some latency involved, and that's why these people still have the right to come forward.
You can find out more about the film The Devil We Know at thedevilweknow.com. It's also available on iTunes, and it features attorney Mike Papantonio, who's been talking to us about the case. Thanks, as always, for talking to us.
Thank you, David.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Anytime we talk about the deficit and the national debt at this point, I find it irresponsible not to remind you that this is a political football. Debt and deficit aren't something that Republicans actually care about. They care about it when it's a Democrat in the White House. Democrats also play the game, although more in a sort of reactive way, when the truth is that debt and deficit matter depending on why we're going into debt and growing the deficit. And I've talked about that before, and we're going to get into that again. That being said, we were told that Donald Trump was going to cut the deficit. He was going to get us out of this deficit problem. He and his ilk have identified that this is a major problem, and they were going to fix it. But we now have new data, and the United States budget deficit has grown to its largest in 6 years, dating all the way back to the Obama presidency. The U.S. budget deficit is now larger than it was at any point during President Obama's second term. The government is actually spending more in 2018, and the deficit has increased by 17% to $779 billion in the current fiscal year. And according to current estimates, the budget deficit will surpass a trillion by 2020. And there's sort of two sides to this, right? There's revenue and expenditures. Trump's tax cuts, revenue to the government, have caused a decrease in the growth of government revenues from 1.5% last year to 0.04% this year. Trump's also spending more on the military, not exactly where we need to be spending more at this point. So the important story here for me, and I've been making this effort whenever we talk about debt and deficit, probably for the last, what would you say, year to year and a half that we've been taking this sort of approach. The important story is not the deficit itself. It's why we have a growing deficit, and it's Republican and Trump hypocrisy on the issue. The latter, the hypocrisy you know about by now. They define social responsibility as balancing the budget, and then they come in and they unbalance the budget more than anybody. George W. Bush did it. Donald Trump is doing it now. The hypocrisy you're familiar with. Once we realize that the deficit in and of itself isn't the problem, that in a growing economy, you can have a deficit that grows in terms of raw dollars, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's growing in terms of relative size compared to the economy. What really ultimately matters is why the deficit grows. In our case right now, the deficit is climbing because businesses got a tax cut and Trump is spending more on the military, to really simplify it, right? And the tariffs aren't going to help since they're going to affect tax revenue as well. In general, when business income goes down, tax revenue to the government from that income also goes down. Just perfectly logical. If the deficit had climbed because imagine that we gave a tax credit to the poor and we combined that with spending more on education, that would be a much better deficit for the economy, and it would be a different story altogether. If the deficit had gone up because we decided we're going to subsidize alternative energy and we are going to make cuts to the number of bases that we have around the world, that would be a really good way for the deficit to expand. We need to take that view on debt and deficit. It's not this Republican-Democrat thing of deficit good, deficit bad, balanced checkbook good, unbalanced bad, as long as it's the other party's guy or gal maybe at some point. What we have to understand is that not every deficit dollar is created equal. And this is one of those things where neither party benefits from pointing this out. It's sort of like a race to the bottom because the other party will play the deficit bad, surplus good game. Everybody has to play it, and you never really end up getting honest discussion about it from our elected officials.
Yeah, and it's typically the Republicans who win out on this issue, even though Bush raised the deficit, Clinton lowered the deficit, Obama lowered the deficit, Trump raised the deficit.
Yeah.
And remember, Trump promised that even though these numbers didn't seem to add up, he said that there would be so much economic growth under his presidency.
It would make up for all of it.
It would make up for all of it, and actually we could pay down the national debt by the end of his second term.
Yeah. So far, we're growing it. We're continuing to grow it, and more importantly, at an even faster rate. But again, we've got to talk about that, but we also have to talk about the fact that this is a losing issue in general because it's being discussed in terms, it's a losing issue for the left because it's discussed in terms that the right has established, and that is really important to understand here. I think some people are going to like this one. 2 Republican operatives from Arizona pretended to be communists and donated to a Democratic congressman to try and make him look bad. And they got caught and they look really, really stupid. These 2 guys used fake names. They used the names Jose Rosales and Ahmad Sadia. They walked into the office of Democratic Congressman Tom O'Halloran. They said, hey, we're here to make a donation to the congressman in cash. They had $39.68 in cash, and they wanted a receipt for the donation written out to the Northern Arizona Communist Party. So they go in with this money. The finance staffer for Congressman O'Halloran tells them, all right, fill out paperwork, and you're going to get a receipt by email. And when they were told that the receipt would come by email and not in person on paper, they crossed out the email that they had originally written down on the form, and they put in a different email address. And that rightly made O'Halloran's finance person wonder, why are they doing that? That's sort of a weird thing to do. They did a little research. They figured out that these were actually Republicans donating to O'Halloran under fake names. And this is the best part. Lindsay Coleman, who's the finance director, she drove with the $39.68 in cash over to the local Republican field office to return the money. Imagine this. She walks in and she sees the guy who claimed to be Jose Rosales in the office, except everyone in there is calling him Oscar. He used a fake name to make the donation.
Wouldn't be surprised if he had a name tag on his desk.
Oscar something else, yeah. He accepted the cash back from O'Halloran's finance director. The other guy was also using a fake name. You might be shocked to hear he wasn't really Ahmad Sadia, the Northern Arizona Communist Party member. Spokeswoman for the Republican running against O'Halloran said, this is news to us. No one from our campaign was involved in this juvenile stunt. So first and foremost, this is a crime. It's against the law to donate to a campaign under a false name. This should be taken seriously. You know, we hear all the time about people are voting without IDs and duplicate voting and whatever. Barely happens. When it does, it's usually a right-winger trying to prove a point. And when they get caught, which is usually, they need to be prosecuted because it needs to be shown that it is really serious to do this stuff. And along those same lines, this should be prosecuted as fully as possible. But if you haven't heard about this tactic before, this is a really old trick. Trump's buddy, his henchman, I guess we would call him, who I've interviewed, Roger Stone, he used to work for the re-election of Richard Nixon. He was supporting Nixon's re-election in the early 70s. And he started sending donations to Nixon had a primary opponent who was very anti-war. And Roger Stone started sending donations to Nixon's primary opponent from the Young Socialist Alliance, the idea being that you can later say, this is outrageous. Nixon's opponent was taking money from the Young Socialist Alliance. So this is a very, very old trick. And maybe the even dumber part of this is that wouldn't a true communist, there are already very few actual out-and-out communists in the U.S. Like there's a bunch of social democrats, there are some socialists. There aren't really that many communists. Would communists really be supporting centrists in the Democratic Party, especially ones like Tom O'Halloran, who used to be Republicans? Like, is that who the Communist Party in the U.S. is going to support?
That should be the first red flag. The other red flag would be that it came from the Northern Arizona Communist Party. Like, how many communist parties do you think there are in Arizona? Is there a Northern, a Southern, an Eastern, a Western? You don't need all those.
If communists are actually out there donating money in this way, I imagine that they would pick like the furthest left Democrats that they could find, right? You're not going to say, you know who the Communist Party really needs to support? Former Republican centrist Dem Tom O'Halloran, right? Like it's stupid to the core. And of course, we know that the right needs to do this stuff to win. They need, consider all of the tactics of the right. Gerrymandering, of course. Voter suppression whenever and wherever it's possible. That includes purging people from voter rolls, restricting early voting, whatever they can do. Smear campaigns, and then in this case, you can add falsifying campaign donations to the list. They need to cheat to win. That is the path forward for them. All you need to do is vote. That's it. If all progressives got out and voted, particularly in midterms, where the voter turnout is pathetically low, the people who are trying to influence elections with fake donations from supposed communists, I hope that they won't have an impact anyway. They definitely have no chance at making an impact if every progressive just got out and voted.
Yeah, Democrats certainly have the hearts and minds of the American people. It's just unfortunate that that hasn't been enough during the past few election cycles.
On the issues they do.
We still have Republicans in control of all three branches of government now.
Even though the left does represent the views on the issues of a plurality of this country, the propaganda war has been won significantly by the right. And that's why you still have people who on paper should probably be voting for Elizabeth Warren if they were able to, if they lived in Massachusetts, thinking that they are moderate Republicans and voting for people like, who's a moderate Republican? I don't know.
Mitt Romney?
Mitt Romney, for example. Yeah, I guess so. Is he moderate? I hope I don't get a backlash for that. I guess, listen, compared to like Ted Cruz,
yeah,
I guess we could say Mitt Romney is sort of a moderate. Yeah. Just get out there and vote. Please vote. That's my message to you. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's an interesting question from a caller. Take a listen to this.
David.
Yes.
It's David from Windsor, Ontario.
Thank you.
What will it take, you ask? Canada and the United States should become one country. If Canada's provinces could be U.S. states, then the more, we have conservatives here too, but they're reasonable conservatives, relatively speaking. And everything you do in Washington affects us directly. So it's in Canadians' best interest that they be able to send elected representatives to Washington, D.C. 20 Canadian senators, even 10 Canadian senators would change everything.
Yes, they would.
Thank you very much.
Not going to happen. So this is one of those ideas that it's interesting to think about, sort of. And I think that there are very interesting sort of like foundational questions that are raised. But first and foremost, I don't know outside of Quebec whether Canadians have any interest in being part of the U.S. as U.S. states. I don't think so. I can assure you that in Quebec, there is no interest whatsoever in becoming part of the United States. That's to begin with. There is no way in hell that the American right would have any interest in any kind of merger project with Canada. Like, it's one of those things where none of the parties involved are going to be interested in something like this.
Well, hey, I mean, we have Alaska up north, and of course we have the contiguous United States, so we'd just be completing that stretch of land. I think we can make that case.
You can make the case, and you will be laughed at, particularly by, listen, I know a lot of people in Montreal and in Quebec City, and the idea of becoming, they don't even want to be part of Canada, lots of them, right? And the idea of saying, we will become a state of the United States, it's just a non-starter.
What about if the U.S. gives up its sovereignty and becomes part of Canada? So instead of Canada becoming part of the United States, you have the U.S. becoming part of Canada. Maybe that would play well in conservative minds?
I suggest talking to the Tea Party caucus about that and seeing what it is, or what do they call it? They've merged into something else now, like the Freedom Caucus, or...
Oh, I love that.
I don't even remember what they're called now. The Extremists in Congress Caucus. I'm sure they'll be all over joining Canada. We've got a great bonus show for you today. Donald Trump now referring to Stormy Daniels as horseface on Twitter. Is this the new normal in terms of how presidents talk about things? It sort of seems to be. We will talk about yet another vile and disgusting act by our fellow New England sports fans. They really are horrible. I mean, it is an embarrassment. I'm as big a fan of New England sports as anybody, Pat, but the fans are vile. Every week we have a new story, every month maybe. We'll also talk about the political leanings of Defense Secretary Jim Mattis. Mad Dog, as Donald Trump likes to refer to him. On the bonus show, www.joinpacman.com to get instant access. Also, become a patron at patreon.com/DavidPacman. And watch the bonus show. The bonus show is great. I'll speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.